I walked through the front door of my grandmother's house still wearing the black dress I had worn to bury her that morning, and the first thing I heard was laughter. Not quiet, subdued grief. Not the kind of muffled crying that should fill a house 12 hours after you lower an 81-year-old woman into the ground. I am talking about loud, open, champagne glass clinking laughter coming from the living room where my grandmother had sat in her favorite green armchair for as long as I could remember. My aunt was in there. My uncle was in there. And my cousin, the one who had not bothered to show up to the funeral until 20 minutes after it started, was in there too. I stood in the hallway with my coat still buttoned and my heels still on, and I did not make a single sound, because something in my chest told me to wait. My name is Claire. I am 29 years old, and 2 weeks before my grandmother passed, she had called me on a Thursday evening and told me she had done something important. She told me she had finally updated her estate documents. She told me the house, a 4-bedroom Victorian in Charleston, South Carolina, that her own parents had built in 1941, along with her savings and her investment accounts, would go to me. She told me this calmly and clearly, the way she said everything, like she had already thought it through 100 times and arrived at perfect peace with the answer. She told me my aunt had been pressuring her for years. She told me she was tired of pretending she did not see what was happening. Then she told me she loved me and she hung up. And 8 days later she was gone. I had come straight from the attorney's office to the house. Her estate attorney, a quiet man named Mr. Gaines, had handed me a certified copy of the final will and trust documents that afternoon and walked me through everything with a calm that I appreciated deeply. The house, the accounts, a small parcel of undeveloped land behind the property that I did not even know existed until that moment. Everything left to me. Her only grandchild on my mother's side, the one she had raised after my mother died when I was 7. I stood in that hallway and listened. My aunt was speaking in the loud, loose way people speak when they have had 2 glasses of wine and feel completely safe. She was saying that the documents were already drafted. She was saying that her lawyer had been very thorough. She was saying that the timing was actually perfect because the developer had reached out again last week, the one who had been trying to buy the property for the past 18 months, and the offer was now sitting at $2.4 million. My uncle said the number twice, like he was tasting it. My cousin laughed and said that was more than enough to finally clear their debt and still have plenty left over, and that the stupid little house had finally become worth something. My aunt said they just needed to get the paperwork filed before I had a chance to contest anything. She said I was too young to fight them. She said I had no money for lawyers. She said I had always been naive, just like my mother, and that sentimentality was not going to hold up in probate court. Then she said the documents showed a revised will, dated 3 weeks ago, leaving everything to her. I pressed my back against the wall of the hallway, and I took a breath so slow and so deliberate that it did not make a sound. My grandmother had called me 2 weeks ago. Not 3 weeks ago, 2. And Mr. Gaines had just placed a certified, court-registered document in my hands that afternoon proving it. I worked as a contracts analyst at a litigation support firm. I had spent the past 6 years reviewing, authenticating, and flagging legal documents for some of the largest law firms on the East Coast. I knew exactly what a forged document looked like. I also knew exactly how to prove it. I pushed the living room door open and walked in. The laughter stopped the way it always does when someone enters a room they were not supposed to enter. My aunt recovered first. She set her glass down on the side table and looked at me with an expression that was performing grief while her eyes were calculating distance. She said she was so glad I was there. She said she had been wanting to talk to me. She said losing my grandmother had been so hard on all of them, on our whole family, and that she wanted to make sure we navigated everything together. My uncle nodded from the couch, holding his wine with both hands. My cousin looked at the carpet. I sat down in my grandmother's green armchair. I pulled my coat tighter. I told my aunt that I had just come from Mr. Gaines's office and that I was exhausted and I was going to stay in the house tonight if that was all right. My aunt said, of course. She said this was still family. She said nothing about what I had heard. She said nothing about the will. She hugged me with arms that felt like the wings of something that was already circling. I went upstairs to my grandmother's guest room and I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time. Then I opened my laptop and I got to work. A forged legal document has specific tells, and the most important one is metadata. Every document created on a computer carries embedded data, the exact timestamp of creation, the software version used, the printer profile, and in many cases the username of the account that generated it. My aunt's lawyer had apparently drafted what they were calling a revised will dated 3 weeks prior, but I had the certified copy of the real will, executed 2 weeks ago. If their document had been backdated, the metadata would show it. And if the signature had been traced or duplicated from an earlier document, a basic spectral comparison would reveal it. I did not have all the tools I needed that night, but I knew exactly who did. I sent 3 emails before midnight. The first was to a forensic document examiner I had worked with on a case the prior year. A woman named Dr. Ellison who operated out of a lab in Columbia, South Carolina. I told her I needed an emergency authentication analysis and asked if she could see me in 2 days. She replied within the hour. The second email was to Mr. Gaines, asking him to flag the estate for any third-party will submissions that might come through probate in the next 2 weeks, and to notify me immediately if any appeared. The third was to a colleague at my firm, who specialized in estate litigation. I told him I might need his help soon and asked him to keep the conversation between us. Then I went to sleep in my grandmother's guest room and I let my aunt believe she had won. She filed the fraudulent will 4 days later. Mr. Gaines called me on a Tuesday morning while I was driving to work. He told me a law firm representing my aunt had submitted a revised will to the probate court, dated 3 weeks prior to my grandmother's death, naming my aunt as sole beneficiary of the entire estate. He told me the signature looked consistent to the naked eye. He told me he was sorry and that I should get an attorney. I told him I already had one. What happened over the next 10 days was the kind of thing that only works if you are patient enough to let it develop completely before you move. I learned that in document fraud cases, the instinct is always to confront too early. You see the lie, and you want to expose it immediately. But early confrontation gives the other side time to adjust, to cover, to create secondary documentation that muddies the record. The cleaner approach is to let the fraud complete its architecture. Let them build the entire structure, then remove the foundation. Dr. Ellison delivered her analysis on day 6. The metadata on the fraudulent document showed a creation date of 9 days ago, not 3 weeks ago, as stated. The document had been created on a Windows system using a version of Microsoft Word that had not even been released until 14 months prior. The signature had been lifted from a power of attorney my grandmother had signed 7 years earlier and digitally superimposed onto the new pages using image layering software. Dr. Ellison could identify the exact pixel inconsistency along the baseline of the letters. She could show the compression artifact where 2 different scanning resolutions had been merged. She put it all in a 40-page certified report and signed her name to every page. I had the report. I had Mr. Gaines's certified copy of the real will with its court registration timestamp. And because I knew what was coming, I had done one more thing. I had called the developer. His name was Mr. Hargrove. He was a commercial real estate developer out of Atlanta who had been trying to acquire the property for a mixed-use project. He had been negotiating with my aunt directly for the past 6 months, which meant my aunt had been having those conversations while my grandmother was still alive. When I called him and explained the situation, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said he would be willing to provide documentation of all correspondence with my aunt, including the dates and the substance of those communications. I told him I appreciated that. He sent me a complete email chain the next morning. The earliest message was dated 11 months ago, and in it my aunt had written that she expected to have control of the property within the year and that he should hold his offer. 11 months ago, my grandmother had been in perfect health. She had been attending her book club and tending her garden and taking her daily walk around the block. My aunt had been planning this for almost a year. I let another week pass. I wanted her to feel secure. I wanted her to start spending the money in her head. I wanted her to call the developer back. She did, on a Thursday afternoon. I know this because Mr. Hargrove forwarded me the email within the hour. My aunt had written to him that the estate matter was proceeding smoothly, and that she anticipated full legal control of the property within 60 days, and that she would be ready to discuss a final purchase agreement at that point. The next morning, I filed a formal fraud complaint with the probate court, submitted Dr. Ellison's authentication report as primary evidence, attached the developer correspondence showing premeditated intent, and requested an emergency hearing to contest the fraudulent submission. My colleague handled the filing. Mr. Gaines provided a supporting affidavit confirming the registration timeline of the original will. By 3 in the afternoon, the court had granted the hearing and issued a temporary freeze on all estate assets pending review. My aunt called me that evening. I let it ring. She called again 20 minutes later. Then my uncle called. Then my cousin sent a text message saying that I was making a terrible mistake and that I was going to destroy the family over a house and that my grandmother would be ashamed of me. I put the phone face down on the kitchen counter and poured myself a glass of water and stood at the window of my grandmother's kitchen, looking out at the backyard she had tended for 40 years. The roses along the back fence were starting to bloom. She had planted those roses the year my mother was born. I picked the phone back up and sent my cousin one reply. I told her I would see the family in court. The hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning at the Charleston County Probate Court. I arrived early, alone, carrying a single leather portfolio with everything I needed organized in labeled tabs. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with pale wooden paneling and large windows that let in a clean morning light that felt almost kind given the circumstances. My aunt arrived with her lawyer, a man in his 50s with the slightly distracted energy of someone who had been handed a case he had not fully vetted. My uncle sat in the row behind her. My cousin sat beside him, arms crossed, staring at her phone. They were dressed carefully, the way people dress when they are trying to look like the reasonable side. My aunt looked at me once when she walked in and then looked away. She had the composure of someone who still believed she held the stronger hand. The probate judge was a woman named Judge Harmon, methodical and unimpressed by theatrics. She reviewed the submitted filings, noted the competing wills, and asked my aunt's attorney to present his position first. His argument was straightforward. He stated that his client had been her mother's primary caregiver in the final year of her life. He stated that the revised will represented his client's genuine wishes as communicated to her in private conversations. He stated that the document had been properly witnessed and notarized, and that the date reflected the actual date of execution. He submitted the notary's signed certification as supporting evidence. I wrote one word in the margin of my notes. I underlined it twice. Then Judge Harmon turned to me. I stood up and I laid out the case the way I had been trained to present complex document analysis methodically, without emotion, moving from fact to fact the way you cross a stream by stepping on stones. I introduced Dr. Ellison's report and walked the judge through the metadata findings. I explained what creation date discrepancy means in document forensics and why it cannot be explained by clerical error. I showed the spectral signature analysis on the projection screen the court clerk had set up, and I pointed to the exact location on the letter formation where two documents had been digitally merged. I showed the pixel density variance at the baseline. I showed the compression artifact. Then I introduced the developer correspondence. When I read aloud the email my aunt had sent 11 months ago, the one where she said she expected to have control of the property within the year, the courtroom went very quiet. My uncle shifted in his seat. My aunt whispered something to her lawyer. My cousin finally put her phone down. My aunt's attorney stood up and objected on the grounds that private business correspondence was not directly relevant to the authenticity of the document before the court. Judge Harmon overruled him without hesitation and told me to continue. I then addressed the notary certification my aunt's attorney had submitted. I had noticed something when I reviewed it the night before. The notary's license number printed on the certification corresponded to a notary whose commission had expired 8 months ago. In South Carolina, a notarization performed by an expired commission notary is legally invalid. I had pulled the state notary registry that morning and printed the current status page. I placed it on the judge's desk without comment and let her read it. My aunt's attorney asked for a recess. Judge Harmon denied it. She reviewed the registry printout. She reviewed the metadata report. She reviewed the developer emails. She removed her reading glasses and set them on top of the stack of papers and looked across the room at my aunt with an expression I recognized from years of watching experienced professionals absorb information they find genuinely alarming. She said the court found substantial and documented evidence that the will submitted by the petitioner had been fraudulently created after the death of the decedent, backdated, and submitted to probate under false pretenses. She said the notarization was invalid on its face. She said the developer correspondence established a pattern of premeditated intent to defraud the estate. She dismissed the fraudulent submission with prejudice and confirmed the original registered will as the governing document. Then she said something else. She said the evidence before the court suggested potential violations of South Carolina criminal statutes on estate fraud, forgery, and filing false instruments with the court. She said she was referring the matter to the county prosecutor for further review and that she was directing the court clerk to preserve and transmit all submitted exhibits for that purpose. My aunt stood up from her chair. She said she wanted to speak. Her attorney grabbed her arm. She pulled it away from him. She said this was her mother's house. She said she had sacrificed years of her life taking care of that woman. She said I had swooped in at the end with my big city job and manipulated a dying old woman into changing a document she did not fully understand. She said I was selfish and calculating and that my grandmother had been confused and afraid and that I had taken advantage of that. Judge Harmon told her to sit down. My aunt said she was not finished. Judge Harmon told her that she was, and that anything further she wished to say should be communicated through counsel. My aunt sat down. Her husband put his hand on her shoulder. She shook it off. My cousin stared at me from across the aisle with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not anger exactly. Something closer to the recognition of a miscalculation. She had grown up watching her mother treat me like a charity case, like the stray that the family tolerated out of obligation, like the girl who would always be too soft and too grateful to push back on anything. She had believed that, completely, right up until this morning. I closed my leather portfolio. I thanked Judge Harmon. I walked out of the courtroom ahead of all of them. Outside on the courthouse steps, the morning air was warm and smelled faintly like rain that had not arrived yet. I sat down on a stone bench and called Mr. Gaines and told him the ruling. He said he was relieved and that we would begin the transfer process immediately. I told him to take his time and do it correctly. He said he would. I sat there for a while longer after I hung up, watching the pigeons on the courthouse lawn, thinking about my grandmother sitting in her green armchair with her book open in her lap. She had raised me on the idea that the truth does not need your help to survive. She said you just had to be patient enough to stand next to it until everyone else could see it too. The county prosecutor opened a formal investigation into my aunt and her attorney 7 weeks later. The attorney surrendered his bar license before the investigation concluded. My aunt was charged with filing a forged instrument and estate fraud. Her attorney cooperated with prosecutors and provided documentation of the full process by which the fraudulent will had been created, including the date, the software used, and who had been present. My aunt eventually accepted a plea agreement that included 2 years of supervised probation, full restitution of legal fees, and a permanent bar from serving as executor or administrator of any estate in South Carolina. My uncle avoided criminal charges. My cousin reached out to me once, 4 months later, through a text message that said she was sorry and that she had not known the full extent of what her mother had planned. I read it twice and then I thought about the night of the wake, the laughter, the way she had sat in my grandmother's living room drinking champagne and talking about the developer's offer. I thought about the text she sent me after I filed the complaint, the one telling me my grandmother would be ashamed of me. I did not reply. I moved into my grandmother's house in the fall. I painted the front porch the same pale blue it had been when I was a child, the color my grandmother had always called her favorite without explanation, just said it made her feel like she was sitting inside a clear sky. I kept the green armchair exactly where it was. I planted new roses along the back fence in the spring, a different variety than the ones she had chosen, but I put them in the same place because the light hits that section of yard in the late afternoon in a way that seems made for roses. I declined Mr. Hargrove's offer. He sent a very polite follow-up letter and I sent a very polite reply explaining that the property was not for sale. He wrote back that he understood and that he respected the decision. I kept his letter in the same file where I keep everything from this story, organized in labeled tabs, in the same leather portfolio I carried into that courtroom. My grandmother was the kind of person who believed that love and money are not the same thing but that people who confuse them cause the most damage in the world. She said the clearest way to understand someone was to watch what they did when there was something to be gained. She had watched her daughter for decades, She had made her decision 2 weeks before she died. She had been entirely clear-headed, entirely deliberate, and entirely right. I think about that phone call often, the Thursday evening call, the one where she told me she was tired of pretending. She sounded peaceful. She sounded like someone who had finished a long piece of work and set it down gently. She told me she loved me and she hung up, and I remember standing in my apartment kitchen afterwards, with the phone still in my hand, and feeling something I could not quite name at the time. I know what it was now. It was the feeling of being seen, completely and correctly, by the one person whose opinion had always mattered most. The house is quiet in the mornings in a way that city apartments never are. The light comes through the kitchen windows at an angle that makes everything look like it belongs to a slower world. I make coffee, and I sit at the table where my grandmother used to sit, and I read the same way she did, slowly, with a pencil for underlining. Someday I will fill up all the margins of her books the way she filled up hers, small, precise notes in the white spaces, arguments and agreements and questions left open. There is a version of this story where I let my aunt have the house, and I told myself it was not worth the fight. I almost talked myself into that version during the first night I spent in the guest room, lying in the dark, running through the cost of lawyers and the length of litigation, and the possibility that judges are human and humans make mistakes. I almost convinced myself that a house is just a structure, that the memory of someone is not contained in wood and plaster, that moving on is sometimes the strongest thing you can do. But then I thought about my aunt's voice in that living room, loose and certain and laughing, and I thought about my grandmother calling me on a Thursday evening to tell me she was tired of pretending. And I understood that there are moments in a life when staying quiet is not grace, it is just surrender dressed up to look like it. If you have ever had to stand your ground for someone who was no longer here to stand it themselves, I want you to know that you are not wrong to do it. You are not being difficult. You are not being selfish. You are being exactly what the people who loved you always knew you were, even before you fully knew it yourself. Thank you for being here. If this story moved you, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. We all have a story of restoration. Sometimes it just takes a little patience to see it through to the end.